Good morning. It's good to see so many supervisors, instructors, program coordinators, and directors, and teacher educators at this conference. My name is Evelyn Young, as Lisa said, and I'm the multiple subject coordinator at UC Irvine. I have the distinct privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Betina Hsieh, for today. Dr. Hsieh is currently the newly appointed Boeing Endowed Professor of Teacher Education and Teacher Learning for Justice at the University of Washington. Prior to that, she was a professor of teacher education for 11 years at Cal State Long Beach, during which time her research focused on teacher identity, critical digital literacies in teacher education, and experiences of teachers and teacher educators of color, with a specific emphasis on Asian American teachers. In her, quote, spare time, she also serves in multiple leadership roles on department, program, university, state, and national levels, including the AERA Research on
Yes.
Education of Asian Pacific American SIG Chair, NCTE Research Foundation Trustee Chair, and California Council on Teacher Education President. It goes without saying that Dr. Hsieh is a
Yes.
well-respected scholar and leader in the field of teacher education, and she leaves a legacy of transforming and humanizing pedagogy in the spaces and lives that she touches. On a more personal note, Bettina and I actually go a ways back. We met at, of all places, at one of our kids' PTAC-sponsored school events. We knew each other as Nate's mom and Matt's mom before we knew each other as Dr. Hsieh and Dr. Young. As we met over lunch one day, we made a secret, unspoken pact that we would leverage our short window of time as parents in the school community to disrupt systemic inequalities from within. How successful we were at doing that, I can't say, but I do know that we were not the most popular parents on campus or in the district. But in the words of another Bettina, Dr. Bettina Love, if you're doing social justice work and everyone likes you, you're not doing social justice work. I am honored to invite my colleague, friend, and co-conspirator to give the keynote talk this morning. Welcome, Dr. Betina Hsieh.
Yay, thank you so much, Evelyn. I was thrilled when Lisa said that Evelyn would be introducing me just because we have shared personal and professional history. So this is really lovely. And it's so lovely to be with you all today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your precious summer and out of your precious professional lives to be here together in community. I'm going to try to share my screen. And you all can hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I am I'm actually celebrating my 21st anniversary tomorrow with my husband. So I'm not at home. And so this is not the setup I'm used to. And so it's just going to take me a second to get everything in the right place. He's a very generous person who has been very supportive of my whole professional life and lets me do virtual keynotes on our anniversary trip. So thank you all for being here today. As Evelyn mentioned, and thank you for being with me for the next 45 minutes. As Evelyn mentioned, my name is Dr. Betina Hsieh. I am currently the endowed professor of teacher education and teacher learning for justice at the University of Washington. I previously was in California for the first 23 years of my teaching and teacher education career. She mentioned my time at Cal State Long Beach. I also was briefly at the University of Laverne, and I spent 10 years as a middle school teacher in Hayward Unified School District up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I also had the privilege of, I noticed when Lisa was showing all of the roles that you face, or all of the roles that you occupy, I had the privilege and opportunity to supervise student teachers while I was a faculty member at Cal State Long Beach. And my supervision experience was deeply impactful in terms of my own perspectives and work in teacher education. So all of the acknowledgement that she gave, I really echo and will say more profoundly towards the end of my talk. So all of this to introduce the topic of the talk. I think Lisa mentioned these are very challenging times. And so I wanted to speak to you today on humanizing communities and responsive relationality, sustaining equitable and just mentoring practices in challenging times. And I should say that my titles are always too long, but this one also probably should have included sustaining ourselves in challenging times, since much of this talk will focus on that as well. Okay. So I want to begin by acknowledging the lands on which I currently reside, even though I'm not there right now and do my work. So the University of Washington exists on Coast Salish homelands, unceded land of the Lachute Seed-speaking peoples, the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, Tulalip, and Puyallup. I am grateful to work as a guest on these lands, and this land acknowledgement is one small act in the process of working to be in good relationship with the land and the people of the land. Additionally, material and community-centered actions are needed to achieve authentic change for these communities. Individual and collective advocacy is necessary to work towards decolonization on these lands and above. And as a non-Indigenous and non-Native person, I am learning about the rich histories of the Indigenous communities on this land that I am privileged to be upon, and invite each of you to engage in this work on the lands where you dwell. Given that this talk is centered on humanizing communities and responsive relationality, I think it's critical to begin with a land acknowledgement, which is one step in honoring and humanizing Indigenous communities who have suffered and continue to suffer dehumanization and genocide on their own lands, both here in what we know as the US and abroad. Further, as I note in the land acknowledgement that I read, responsive relationality is action-based, and there are many ways for us to take action to support the tribal communities on whose land we live and work. I paid a land tax when I lived in Southern California. There's a QR code there for the Real Duwamish site to pay a land tax for them. But there are other ways to support tribal communities in the ways that they wish to advocate for themselves, whether it's federal recognition, donations, advocacy. But I think this is fitting, as so much of the work of supervision is often grounded in coming alongside others. And I think Lisa mentioned that briefly as she was giving her opening comments. This is really the work that you do in community. So the next thing I wanted to do was for us to check in, first with ourselves and our bodies, and then with one another via the chat box. And I really wish that we could all be gathered together in person, in which case we do a turn and talk and have you check in. But to try to make the most of your time, and I know that you will have lots of space for interaction later. I'm going to use the chat in a moment, and then if we have time at the end, maybe we can do a quick breakout check-in, but I'm kind of doubting it because I don't have a ton of time with you. First, though, I'd like to start with our breath. So you see there's a GIF embedded in the slideshow, and on the next kind of inhale, we'll actually take a few breaths together with the GIF just to center ourselves in the space. And I think this is one part of sustainability that often gets overlooked, is how we actually take a moment to be with our breath and be with ourselves as we approach all the things that are going on around us. So I'm going to inhale now. Pause. And exhale. And inhale. Pause. And exhale. And one more breath together. Inhale. Pause. And exhale. And as I start talking again, I hope this will give you a moment to consider what you hope to gain from today and the 2 days of the conference, and also just serve as a reminder. I think the world is moving at a constantly fast pace that kind of prevents us sometimes from just taking a few deep breaths and getting recentered, and causes us to be reactive rather than responsive. And so I think this is one simple way to just remind ourselves that we don't have to constantly be in fight or flight mode. The next thing that I'd like you to do is to type into the chat box a response to these questions, but don't hit enter yet. So the first question is when, where, and with whom? So 3-part question: when, where, and with whom do you feel the most human? When, where, and with whom do you feel the most human? And I'm going to give you about 15 to 30 seconds to just think about that and write that in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. Okay, and if you are ready, go ahead and hit enter. When, where, and with whom do you feel the most human? Okay, so lots of folks, I'm seeing lots of family, right? So lots of family, sometimes in our spiritual communities, at home. Oops, did I start a timer? I didn't even mean to do that. I meant to start the stopwatch. Technology, it's so fun. Um, yeah, with family, lots and lots of family, which does not surprise me because we are a group of educators who are deeply committed to children. So seeing your own children here makes a lot of sense. I see um, some folks in nature with friends. Oh, Gabriela, I love when I am necessary, that I feel very human in those moments too. Yeah, and the ocean, beautiful. So I want you to, you know, this is another thing that I often do when I'm not feeling at my best in my human self. I try to kind of remember where I do feel most human, and I'll get to that in a second. Just because it helps to remind me why I do what I do. So the second question, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to just pause for 30 seconds and then you'll hit enter with everybody together. So how do you or would you like to bring your full humanity into your work as a supervisor? So how do you or would you like to bring your full humanity into your work and specifically in a supervision context? And I'll give you a little bit longer to reflect on that since that might be a little bit of a longer answer. Okay, and if you feel ready, go ahead and hit enter now. How do you or would you like to bring your full humanity into your work? Okay, so some beautiful answers, right? Empathy and humility, patience, being in relationship, being vulnerable, um, being realistic and understanding, checking in, right? Putting aside preconceived notions, setting one's own self aside to receive what is necessary, sharing of ourselves, being ourselves and bringing our identity into the work. Yeah, I love that, bringing in humanity, but first really understanding our students and their comfort, coming from this shared value that we're here to serve students, support, listen, caring. Um, yeah, seeing students and community, school community as family. Um, yeah, lots of empathy, knowing where people feel the most human, working on presence, authentic conversations. You all have great answers. I don't think you need this talk, actually, Lisa. You could have just had everybody talk to each other, which you all will do in a little bit. But yeah, just some beautiful, beautiful answers, spaces of recognition, being in natural relationships, sharing your joy. yeah, lots of relationship building and honesty and being vulnerable, and being present, creating community, sharing all of ourselves, not just our successes, but our failures, um, being a good listener, sharing your own life journey, building relationships. So beautiful answers. So, I think this is really lovely because it really does show that so many of us are coming from a very similar place in terms of thinking about the ways our humanity really underlies our work. So thank you for participating in that kind of interactive portion of today's talk. And that is really the spirit with which I'm grounding kind of the whole talk. Um, so I wanted to share with you a little bit about my answer to these two questions. So I've put together this slide as a more in-depth introduction to me, because I think that often in professional spaces, we do exactly what the formal introduction that went into the program did. And I love that Evelyn actually then kind of built upon that with talking about our personal connections. Because I think a lot of times we're asked to leave these parts where we feel the most human outside of our work. And yet in our work, it really informs what we do. So I feel most human when I'm in community and connected with my actual family in the top left corner, and with many of these folks who I feel like are chosen family all around this slide. And I feel most human when I feel like I'm being of contribution. And um, I bring my full humanity into my work through emphasizing humanizing practices, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Love as a transformational practice, and engaging deep listening and co-inquiring into my work. So I really seek, like many of you, to foster deep relationships and amplify voices which aren't often heard or held in high regard, even though they have many important things to contribute. And so, as I mentioned, you see my family up in the top left corner, my husband, who's at the Museum of Modern Art, while I'm giving this talk, my son, who's at home watching our dog, who is the child that Evelyn mentioned in the introduction, and my 10-year-old who's at her first sleepaway camp right now. So part of my heart is with her. And then some great colleagues. I love food. If you follow my Instagram, it's not professional at all. All it is pictures of food. And then some students at a recent graduation that are master's students in language, literacy, and culture. In the lower left is another student of mine who's a doctoral student, and then their Indigenous collaborator, their dissertation is on Indigenous communities. And so it was a real privilege. I went to Taiwan, which is where my mother and father both came to the US through, for the first time in May, and got to hear my student give their talk, and then also be in community um, with their Indigenous colleague and partner. The center bottom is my colleague and friend, Dr. Roland Santos Coloma. That's our new book, Shameless Promotion, Moments and Movements. It's on critical Asian American plus studies in K-12 teacher education and higher education. We're super proud of that collaborative collection. And then the last picture on the lower right is, you see my daughter as a little one. She was 3 or 4 in that picture wearing a pomelo hat. And I just recently gave an edu talk on love as the center of transformative practice, or love at the center of transformation. And it was really talking about humanizing practices. And so this is an extended version of some of the things that I said there. But it was talking about how love can transform a simple citrus fruit into a princess crown for a little girl. So, um, so that's a little bit more about me, because I think it's really important. So at the core of my talk today are really these two interrelated ideas of humanizing communities and responsive relationality, which both fall under a framework of humanizing practices in education. So I recently gave an edu talk, as I mentioned, which was a short 5-minute TEDx style talk. I have a longer 12-minute TEDx talk, which is actually not all that different because I'm the same person. It's on reconceptualizing excellence in education. And it was really, it was done just prior to the pandemic shutdown, really helping us to think about, like, what does it mean? What does it truly mean to be excellent in education? And it was actually based large in a large part on the experiences that I had at the school where Evelyn and I met. or my son had at that school. But this talk was on humanizing practices in education, and you can access that with a QR code or a quick Google search. So I won't repeat that. But I do want to give a few core principles that are related to what humanizing practices in education are. So humanizing practices in education recognize that we are not simply disembodied brains, devoid of experiences and knowledge, waiting to be efficiently filled with facts and given purpose. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the work of Paulo Freire, who talks a lot about humanizing practices and that education should not be in a banking model, that we're not here to be filled. Instead, humanizing practices acknowledge our whole selves as important to learning, growth, and engagement. And that's partly why we started with our breath. Humanizing practices are also based on learning in community and learning with and from one another. So it really challenges a hierarchical model. A few years back when I was at Cal State Long Beach, we actually changed what we called university supervisors to call um, those of you who do this role university mentors, just to really get away from this idea of kind of supervising over, right? And really kind of thinking about the ways in which the work that we do is really mentoring and guiding teacher candidates towards moving towards full-time teaching. And then the last thing is, while teachers, teacher educators, and supervisors are important guides in the process of learning, in a humanizing paradigm, we do this work through connecting with the experiences and knowledge that learners bring to the space, right? So when teachers are teaching, they're promoting learning through connecting with the experiences and knowledges of their students. Similarly, when we as teacher educators and supervisors do that, it sticks better when we're connected with what's important to our teacher candidates and what they bring into the space. So again, the idea is that humanizing practices really challenge traditional hierarchies and are based on the premise that everybody has something to contribute to the teaching and learning process. So now that we know what humanizing practices are, what exactly do I mean by humanizing communities and responsive relationality, and how do they fit into practicum experiences? So in line with the definition of humanizing practices, humanizing communities are teaching and learning communities that recognize the value of each person's full humanity, what they bring to a learning space, and how we can all grow in community. Very much like this symposium, right? This conference, right? Really thinking about what is it that each of us brings into a learning space and what can we share through our unique contributions. In contrast, I think in so much of our society, people get talked at, and that happens especially, I know technology was one of the things you mentioned that you all were interested in. I think it happens particularly in technology-based spaces. I am a big social media participator but I've had to actually take a step back to think about how to rehumanize social media spaces, which often feel like you're being talked at instead of talked with. So humanizing communities are kind of opposed to that in terms of being interactive and affirming, acknowledging where each person is at and supporting them to grow in ways that they value. So I've included a few places where humanizing communities can be implemented in practice or in practicum. And each of these examples may require changes to traditional supervision or classroom structures, but each also has the potential to promote authentic engagement, leadership, and learning for those who are involved. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of them in depth, but just thinking about kind of what are spaces that we can really challenge traditional hierarchies, that we can build community among. Some of us supervise multiple student teachers or like run student teacher seminars. What are ways that we can create humanizing community in those seminar spaces? And then what are ways that we can facilitate classroom learning or learning, student teaching that honors and affirms students and communities' cultural and linguistic funds of knowledge. So just kind of thinking about like, how does this apply in your own context? The second core concept in my talk is responsive relationality. Oh, this is, I actually really timed out my talk and I was like, this is going much faster in reality than it was in the timing. So I'm going to probably talk a little bit faster, but that's okay. You'll get what I'm saying. The second core concept in my talk is that of responsive relationality. So what I'm calling responsive relationality is similar to what Judith Kleinfeld and Lisa Delpit called being a warm demander. It's a teacher or mentor that holds high expectations with deep care and responds accordingly. So responsive relationality is grounded in love and a commitment to honoring one's own humanity, the person with whom we're interacting, often a student teacher or a mentor teacher, or for student teachers, the children in their care, and responding in ways that are grounded in an ongoing relationship of trust and confidence, right? So we spend so much time building a relationship because that relationship doesn't often end at the end of the quarter or semester or time that we have with our teacher candidates, but really will stay with them into their teaching career. And supervision based on responsive relationality is keeping that in mind, very intentional, responds to intention as well as execution, because we know that we're mentoring new teachers. It notes gaps between where a student teacher is and where they want to be, and then communicates clearly and with care. Okay, so why incorporate this idea of humanizing communities and responsive relationality into our supervision? So I think the most straightforward reason is that teaching and learning are inherently relational. And I think all of your chat responses show that you already got that. And I am not surprised coming into the room. I think while the world becomes ongoingly more transactional, and while we are told that AI can do some parts of teaching better than humans can, what can't be replicated in our work is the deeply human nature of building alongside one another. More specifically, the supervisor or university mentor relationship with student teachers and classroom teachers, that triad provides a critical opportunity to bring different perspectives and forms of knowledge together in the service of creating enriching learning environments for students. So this gives us an opportunity to make and model classrooms as humanizing spaces and allow for responsiveness. I saw this firsthand supervising during the early part of the pandemic, when the technological skills of many of the student teachers, supported by the instructional and curricular design skills of mentor teachers, allowed for synergy and engagement with students based on pre-existing relationships that were built prior to lockdown. And so supervisors in this case offered support to both student teachers and mentors in acknowledging their complementary strengths and providing new perspectives. Finally, a point that I emphasize in my edu talk is the importance of models of the change that we wish to see. So I think while many teachers, particularly teachers from marginalized communities themselves, including those who may not have had the best experiences in K-12 education, they want to bring different pedagogies, oftentimes culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogies, curriculum that responds to their students and these practices into classrooms, but they lack models of humanizing practice in education. So by integrating a humanizing community approach and responsive relationality in our supervision practice, supervisors have an opportunity to model humanizing practices in real time for student teachers, which then they can integrate hopefully in their classroom and in doing one-on-one or small group work, or even in their larger classroom practice with students. So, while teaching and supervision are inherently relational, often we can also get caught up in the logistical and transactional work of supervision, which becomes sometimes really overwhelming. We have lots of forms to fill out. And logistical and transactional work is important, it's necessary, but it can limit our focus to what isn't working or what needs to be shown on a performance assessment, instead of keeping us present with the teacher candidates themselves. It can also lead us and student teachers to focus solely on what is being taught or what is being assessed without considering who is being taught and the context of learning, which is really, really tough. And sorry, I'm trying to follow both chat and my notes and the screen, but I noticed Gregory's comment about supervising interns who don't have support from administrators or mentor teachers. And I think in those situations, supervisors play an even more critical role, not having that triad of support, because interns often are kind of thrust into teaching without a lot of the supports or humanization or yeah, the space to be human in their early teaching. And then finally, I think that a lot of this logistical and transactional work can lead to the reproduction of inequities and over standardized ways of thinking and teaching. And I think that really steals the joy of our work away from us. So how do we then build sustainable, equitable, and just mentoring practices? So before I get to kind of offering some thoughts on this, I'm like keeping track of time. Um, I'd like to preface by acknowledging a few key points that are based on some of my most recent research around educator pushout. And I think Gregory's comment actually highlights some of the things that we saw in our study around educator pushout. Um, and I think that has to do with the systemic nature of unsustainability, inequity, and injustice. Um, I think we have to start by acknowledging that unsustainability, inequity, and injustice are systemic features of educational institutions and systems. Because without this acknowledgement, individuals within these systems feel like they are failing. So I don't know if any of you have ever felt like a failure. I feel like that at least weekly, because within this system, I'm struggling to reach my ideals. And I think reframing that in terms of systems designed to reproduce inequities and move towards efficiency over relationality, it actually helps to understand that we are swimming upstream, we are navigating these systems, even as we advocate to change them. And hopefully it helps to give ourselves a little space as well as our teacher candidates. In doing so, we have to recognize that the choice to engage in relational humanizing forms of supervision or mentoring is actually an act of resistance in efficiency-based mentoring contexts. Resistance, as Evelyn said, right? Resistance or not being the most popular, likable person when we're doing justice-based work comes at a cost. And often there can be a trade-off between sustainability and relationality. I think it was Gabriel or Gabrielle who said that, sometimes it's like we're putting others in front of our own humanity. So we have to be careful to value our own humanity. Because it's hard, right, to give grace to ourselves in the midst of our own exhaustion. But if we don't, we can't actually be there for TCs. So I think recognizing that sometimes our individual efforts will at times fall short is hard but necessary. And so I want us to think about how we support one another and TCs when this happens. So I would offer 3 ways for us to build sustainable, equitable, and just mentoring practices. I'll introduce them here really quickly, and then we'll just jump into them. So first, drawing from clear, cohesive equity and justice-centered frameworks and helping move these from theory to practice. I think that's a unique thing that supervisors get to do. And often when I'm teaching methods classes, I feel like I don't get to do this really as much. Investing in humanizing professional relationships and relational networks from day one, and then encouraging professional community by leveraging existing structures and centering them on core equity principles. So let's talk about this first one. So I've just listed a few questions on this slide that can help support this idea of how we draw from clear, cohesive, equity, justice-centered frameworks and move from theory to practice. So if these questions are helpful in terms of thinking about your own context, what I wanted to share is actually a little bit about an initiative that I was fortunate to co-lead and participate in when I was at Cal State Long Beach called the Caminos Project. Just as an example of this. So the Caminos was part of a 5-year Department of Education grant for Hispanic serving institutions that focused on supporting recruitment and retention efforts for more Latina teachers into and through teaching pathways to full certification. For the faculty development part of the grant, we led multiple cycles of faculty professional learning, moving the ideas of culturally responsive and sustaining practices and cultural and linguistic funds of knowledge from theory to practice in our teacher preparation program. And we knew that we had to get everybody on board in order to really make this theory to practice shift. So we began in our methods courses, but we knew that teacher candidates and faculty themselves, honestly, might have limited experience seeing theory translated into practice. In fact, we read one of Evelyn's pieces, right, talking about that challenge of like, you understand the theory, but how do you translate it into practice? So we spent some time developing tenets. And this is where the clear, cohesive framework comes in. Tenets of CRSP, and then examples of what this might look like in practice. We integrated those prompts into field work first, and then eventually we work to translate that from what students were seeing to what students were enacting in classrooms. And our supervisors were key to moving these ideas from theory to practice. So we supported supervisors in developing their own understandings of CRSP and then helping candidates understand both what this could look like and how they might implement these into their practices. So how we did this was integrating alongside the California standards for the teaching profession, culturally responsive sustaining practices tenets into our debrief observation form so that we were talking about both kind of simultaneously. And I do want to, the caveat is this work was initially funded, the framework had been invested in, but I think that this could be done on a smaller scale within a supervision context, thinking about how cohesion could be built between what students are learning in their methods course. And I know some of you are faculty who teach methods as well as doing supervision. So how do these courses kind of dovetail with things that they're actually seeing in the field and that you want them to enact? Okay, I'm going to have to move even faster. So the second element is this idea of building, investing in humanizing professional relationships and relational networks from day one, like STENT, right? So we actually can't engage in responsive relationality if we don't have strong relationships from the start. And that's relationships in many different directions. So most of you noted, right, that you spend a lot of time developing relationships with your teacher candidates, but relationships also with what brought them into teaching, what are their goals for student teaching, and for student learning, and then what are their experiences in education and in the teacher preparation program. I think this knowledge helps you to co-construct and adapt your mentoring relationship based on your humanity, the TC's humanity, your different roles, and the student teaching context, as well as allowing you to establish cohesive goals that are shared between you. Finally, it's critical to encourage professional community by leveraging existing structures and centering them on core equity-focused principles. So again, I list some questions here. I'm co-authoring a book actually based on the program that I mentioned earlier, the Keynote project. And one of the things we talk about in terms of sustainability is not reinventing the wheel when it's not necessary. And I think that is even more important in this moment when funding and resources are scarce and time is precious. And so because we are in this time, most humans that I know, including myself, have very little bandwidth to create new structures and take on new things. And so I wonder if instead we can look around at what already exists. Like, are there existing cohorts, affinity groups, alumni networks, supervision groups, communication structures, like your LMS, your Canvas page, your listservs, et cetera, that could be focused to support equity-driven goals and enhance relationality? And then can teacher candidates be offered additional forms of support beyond top-down mentoring structures? So part of humanizing communities is this idea of mutuality. And so could student teaching seminars or cohort groups be used for student teachers to share not only challenges, but creative pedagogies, integrating these opportunities that emphasize professionalism from day one, even early in their careers? All of this kind of begs the question, how do we continue to do these works in challenging times? And again, this is the introduction slide, but I'm going to kind of come straight into these ideas. So how do we do this for ourselves? I think one thing is finding institutional support, allies, and professional networks with shared commitments. So when we look around our institutions and our professional communities, we might ask ourselves who shares our commitments to equity and justice-centered work. What are our current relationships with these folks, and how do we build upon these relationships? I have really felt the importance of this in my own recent transition of institutions, states, and roles. As I mentioned, my entire teaching career, 23 years, was in California, and I was well networked within both state and institutional contexts, and well respected. I'd built deep relationships, I'd proven my leadership. And then I moved into this role where I don't know the state standards in the same way. I don't know the teacher accreditation standards. It's a lot, right? But my equity commitment had stayed the same. And so now I'm in this unfamiliar place, at a very different type of institution. And in the last 18 months, a lot of my groundwork that I've had to do is figuring out who shares my commitment, how do I invest in those relationships, and how do I find avenues for support. And I think it's really difficult. I don't know if there's anybody in the room who has ever felt uprooted from a community, but it's it's hard, right? And so I think it is possible, and it's essential in sustaining our work, even as we advance it in these difficult times. I'm so glad you love these questions, Erin. I'm always worried, like, how is this going to land with everybody? So the next important part of continuing these works in this time is um, being clear on what is core and essential in our work when challenges arise for individuals, right? So I think one thing is focus is also a form of resistance, right? We are pulled in so many different directions on a daily basis that clarity on what is core and essential in our work is really critical. These times are times of additional layers of difficulty on top of the inevitable stress and pressure which student teachers, supervisors, and teacher educators face regularly. So in the face of anti-DEI context, cuts to funding, threats to community, threats to community, particularly some of our community members' legal status, funding, and just our existence on a daily basis, we have to be able to focus on what's essential. And so I think if in these moments we can remember that focus is a form of resistance, it will really help us to move forward towards shared goals. And I think sometimes, again, we can't solve the things that are outside of our control. So we can ask ourselves, how can we provide stability and continue moving towards shared goals, and or hold space to come back to these goals once like these immediate survival conditions are addressed? And what are the things that have to happen to continue our work with integrity and in line with our commitments during this time, even if it feels like we're just treading water instead of moving forward, because that is part of sustaining the work. Okay, lastly, and I've been alluding to this, we have to hold space for our own humanity. And I think for many of us, this is the hardest part. We are so good at being there for others, for our families, for our student teachers, our teacher candidates, our like people in our lives, but we struggle with taking care of ourselves. And I will be the first one to admit that I am that person. So we can't pour from an empty vessel. I would ask each of us, therefore, to consider, how do we hold ourselves accountable to model self-care and to engage in community care, right? How do we think about the ways that we are being these models for the practices we hope that our the educators in our care would take on? I also wonder, how do we center humanity and joy every day and in the interactions we have with teacher candidates and mentor teachers? We were fortunate to bring Dr. Goldie Mohammed to our campus earlier in the spring. And, you know, her work on centering joy is just so important in this time as a form of resistance, and how we can continue to see possibility in this world around us is so important. And some of you are already doing the things that I put in as examples, no surprise here, but kind of thinking about like, before we jump into like, how do you think it went today? Can we check in, right, with our teacher candidates or our student teachers? And or when we know that something in the world may be impacting our TCs, even if we're not meeting with them, like, are there ways for us to check in? Can we take our own reminders to breathe, remind them to breathe, hydrate, and also share things that bring us joy and encourage balance, and ask them to do the same? I don't have time for you to pause and reflect because I'm already over, but I hope that you will take this talk and really think about what resonates for you and what's one next step. Because I think that it feels very overwhelming when we're looking at everything we're up against. And so often I have learned in my hardest moments, if I can really just break it down to moment by moment or the next step, the one next step, that's really helpful for me in not feeling so overwhelmed. Okay, so I am going to end, but I actually wanted to end very similarly to how Lisa ended with a closing acknowledgement. I really the role of supervisors and university mentors in teacher preparation is critical, and it's too often underappreciated. And I want to say what an honor it is. There is there are very, very few groups that I would have broken away from my anniversary, like to do this in a hotel room for. But I think the work that you all do is so critically important and so underappreciated. And so I wanted to close by acknowledging you, your investment in your own professional growth, being here at STENT, your investment in this network and in one another. You are a gift to your teacher candidates, to your programs, and hopefully also to yourselves. Um, the work you do is so important and even more so in challenging times. So that's it. I know we don't have time for questions or comments because I'm already cutting into your next time, but you are welcome to find me. You can email me anytime. I won't get back to you in the next 24 hours, but I will. I'm usually super quick with email. It's just because I'm celebrating my anniversary. But I'm also on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. And just so super grateful to be here with you all today. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Betina. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us today, this morning, and start us off on such a inspiring note. I definitely feel um, like I can make some commitments to and have some ideas swirling in my head. So thank you so much. We appreciate you. And then lots of love coming in the chat for you. And happy anniversary. All right. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we're going to take a quick break, everyone. The links for the next workshops hopefully are all in order. I will put those in the chat and just so you have them handy. But thanks, everyone.